Be it resolved, the TSA will reverse the decision allowing small knives and other objects previously deemed as threats onto commercial airlines. In a post-9/11 world that has thwarted many terrorist attacks on commercial flights in the United States, it seems as though the Transportation Security Administration would like to be counterproductive in the leaps and bounds we've made in air security. By allowing some knives shorter than 2.36 inches, 2 golf clubs, cross sticks, souvenir bats less than 24 inches and 24 ounces, ski poles, hockey sticks, and pole cues, the TSA is willing to compromise safety to give people a little bit more freedom to people traveling in commercial aircraft. When the TSA changed the policy that has worked for over 10 years, they asked for the input and suggestions of the airlines it would affect, right? Wrong. The TSA has allowed these items without formally making the airline industry aware of any changes, instead choosing to go over their head to make a drastic reversal of the previous policy. According to Doug Parker, the CEO of U.S. Airways, the airlines would have loved if the TSA, quote, seeked input before implementing a change in policy that might place our flight attendants at risk. Instead of collaborating and coming up with an agreeable policy that favors all parties, the secure administration we pay for through taxes created this new, highly unpopular policy without listening to the businesses. They even turned a blind eye to the companies that operate the planes and their crews, making it seem as though the TSA can do whatever it wants in regards to airport security, and the suggestions of businesses is tossed out without due consideration. Defending his new policy change, the TSA Administrator, John Pistola, checked with another federally funded agency. Pistola checked with the Federal Air Marshal Service, which puts undercover agents dressed as civilians on random flights to deal with any commotion or troubles as they arise. After their recommendation, he backed off slightly and took away knives with locking mechanisms or molded hand grips because of the worry that these knives could cause more damage than the knives that lack these accessories. Pistola was even pondering whether to allow box cutters back on the planes. Box cutters were used in the 9/11 attacks to slit the throats of anyone who got in the way of the hijackers' terror plots. Typically, the length of a box cutter is less than 2.36 inches, yet they still killed innocent people. According to Pistola, it is due to these, quote, emotional ties to 9/11 that he omitted box cutters. Emotion is not common sense. If a box cutter killed once, knives just like it could kill again. This idea is exactly what the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, or FLEOA, George Randall Taylor says. He says this policy makes it seem as if, quote, we didn't learn anything from 9/11. This sentiment is also incredibly common among other marshals and law enforcement officers that help to secure airplanes while being undercover. According to Taylor, he has, quote, received about 100 calls from air marshals. They are very upset. If people who are protecting airplanes in flight fear for their safety from these knives, then we as a society should not feel safe with this policy in place. The flight attendants of the airplane do not feel safe either. These attendants are people who do not have reinforced steel door protecting them like pilots, or any weaponry like a gun or knife that air marshals have. The only thing protecting them from the knife of an attacker is their wits and measly self-defense course. Flight attendants despise this new policy, so much so that one of the largest unions for flight attendants, the Associations for Flight Attendants, organize protests at many different airports throughout the country. The people who fly for a living know the true dangers of enraged passengers, ones that could do real damage with a knife. They feel as though dangerous situations could arise if the policy were to be kept in place. Pistola has no real concept of what these objects could do, and is only selfishly looking at ways to create greater efficiency and cost effectiveness, which will not even be a result of this policy change. He is willing to take a chance that no one will be hurt just to cut costs, a morally wrong decision. The idea that knives smaller than 2.36 inches is not dangerous because they lack a locking mechanism is simply not true. Proponents of this policy have forgotten that someone could plainly place their finger on the dull side of a blade to create an effect similar to a locked blade. Along with box cutters, the 9/11 hijackers also have receipts of 2 Leathermans that have never been recovered, and were most likely on the plane with the hijackers during 9/11. By the standards of this policy, knives just like the Leathermans would be once again allowed on planes. In the time since 9/11, we have made significant advancements in airport security through multiple thought-out, well-informed TSA policies. The policy includes knives less than 2.36 inches without locked blades or molded hand grips, and many other items is not one of those decisions that will help us as passengers on flights to become safer. Instead, passengers on commercial flights will be at a greater risk for attacks on passengers and crews, something that nobody wants to see happen. The Flight Attendant Associations have spoken out and created a greater amount of awareness for the danger this policy will put them at risk for. They have also not been asked for their input or advice in the forming of this policy. Neither have the companies who operate these flights, such as Delta, American Airlines, or U.S. Airways, which all oppose this law and were not contacted for their ideas or input. The only people that were contacted were the federal marshals that also oppose the knife policy and still help to decrease the types of knives that were allowed in it. Pistola argues that the new policy will help the TSA officers focus their search on, quote, catastrophic issues on flights, such as bombs and IEDs. The idea that allowing knives would help the officers to become more efficient is something that is simply not a result of this switch. Searchers will have to go through the guidelines for each knife to see if it is allowed on a plane, making it even less efficient than before. If this policy is implemented, it will show that the TSA has reverted to a less safe state that makes the lessons we learned from 9/11 almost worthless. Safety on an aircraft must be held as the #1 priority, instead of freedoms for the passengers. It is due to this that I call for you to accept the proposal. Be it resolved, the TSA will reverse the decision allowing small knives and other objects previously deemed as threats onto commercial aircraft.
The Transportation Security Association is attempting to reduce inconveniences and make flying a more approachable mode of transportation for all people. Flying should be a more convenient form of transportation, as fewer people die each year from flight than from land-based vehicles. According to an article on CNN, in 2011 there were nearly 85 times more deaths from car accidents than from plane malfunctions. Passengers are often forced to either abandon items that are not allowed on board or pay for their shipping. This is one of the nuisances of flight. Another nuisance is to show up much earlier than the flight to ensure that one is through security by the time for boarding. Yet another problem for some is eating with plastic utensils. Although almost everyone has used them, it is still very difficult to eat a steak or anything of the like with a plastic dinnerware. This change in policy will help to resolve all three of these issues. The inconveniences aren't limited to the passengers, though. According to the Federal Times, at one point there were 10 tons of confiscations in the Los Angeles International Airport alone. This accumulation of confiscated items is such that the TSA has to sell these personal belongings to states, who then sell these personal belongings online or in government surplus stores. One may think that the TSA would want this profit to continue, but it would seem that the TSA would rather lose the profit and use less man-hours searching for and confiscating items that are no longer severe risks to the flights. Between flight marshals and an increasing number of flight attendants trained in self-defense, these items are likely to be less dangerous on planes than on buses, trains, or other forms of transportation. The time that the security personnel spend searching for these belongings could be much better spent. It could be spent searching for items that could be used in IEDs, as Josh said. In my opinion, that should be more of a priority than a small knife someone forgot in their pocket. The TSA agrees. A greater number of people would be affected by the detonation of a bomb than by any of these items, even if they were in the hands of a highly skilled person with questionable intentions. The armed flight marshal would readily be able to restrain any persons with any of these items, as he's the only person that is armed. In many recent cases, problem passengers have simply been tackled by the other passengers. Although one may think that this change in policy is a huge jump, it's barely a hop. Many items that one may consider to be as dangerous as a 2.36-inch pocket knife are already allowed on board. Items such as knitting needles and crochet hooks are allowed on board, as well as small blunt scissors with blades under 4 inches. The TSA has been easing us back over to fewer regulations since the development of security features in the airplanes that greatly reduce the risk of failure of the flight, such as the hardened cockpits. The TSA realizes that there are still many emotions connected to box cutters and will not be allowing them onto planes, although it would be relatively safe to do so. The United States of America declared a war on terror shortly after the events of September 11th, 2001. This war has since been renamed. We declared this war, though, with this title. In order to win a war against terror, we must eliminate our fear. We must eliminate our reaction to fear at a national level. Our reaction to terrorism was to throw restrictions and policy into place until people felt safe again. It was self-sabotage to our own war. If we inconvenience ourselves due to our fear, then the terrorists have won. By reducing restrictions, we are taking back our freedom. We are showing that we will no longer be oppressed by anyone's actions. This is a small step in what many politicians still call today the war against terror.